Morning.
Morning, everybody. And it's now 10 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. My name is Laura Brewer. I work for Attorney General Stein. I'm just going to give us a couple of the ground rules to get us started this morning. First, participants who are speaking will have about 3 minutes to share their views. Unfortunately, because we are constrained for time, we will have to mute people if they go on for too much longer than 3 minutes, but you will get a warning. It won't just happen all of a sudden. In the chat box, if you do have more to say or you want to weigh in on what someone else has said, please feel free to put any comments you have in there. You may also want to include your email address in those comments, so if we don't get a chance to follow up on them during today's conversation, we can follow up with you afterwards. With that, I should also mention that there's a website, www.ncdoj.gov/TREC, where you can also file any comments you have with the task force and learn more about the task force's work. With that, I can turn it over to Attorney General Josh Stein to get us started.
Thanks, Laura, for getting us kicked off, and thanks for all your work and helping to pull this together. Really want to thank everyone for making time available this morning. We all know that we are confronted with a real challenge for our criminal justice system. The killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, really has forced a national reckoning on the way our criminal justice system treats Black people, and forcing everyone to recognize that they're not treated equally or fairly. So it is incumbent upon all of us to try to make the system work as it should. You know, the words on the face of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. are equal justice under law. And that's what we have to try to achieve here. That is why Governor Cooper asked Justice Anita Earls and me to co-chair this task force for racial equity and criminal justice. The task force has about 24, 25 people representing all of the relevant perspectives that have a stake in making our criminal justice system work. It ranges from people who are justice involved themselves or criminal justice reform advocates, criminal defense lawyers, county commissioners, mayors. We've got advocates for victims, advocates for the disabled, prosecutors, judges, sheriffs, line officers. So we've really got the full range of views represented, but we are all committed to the same goal, which is to make it work right for the people of North Carolina. We have had 2 task force meetings to date. In our second meeting, we adopted 3 recommendations. 1 was a ban on law enforcement use of chokeholds. 2 was a duty on law enforcement to intervene when another officer is exceeding his or her authority, and to report that to a supervisor. And the 3rd was a recommendation to the Supreme Court to adopt a rule that judges take into account a person's ability to pay before levying a fine or fee, so we do not criminalize poverty. And there was universal consensus that these were necessary steps. And just to be clear, these were just preliminary steps. We know we have so much more work to do on all aspects of the criminal justice system. We've divided our work into 4 working groups, 2 of them around the issue of law enforcement, 2 of them around the issue of the courts and beyond. And that's really how we're going to structure our conversation today. Is I'm going to take the first half of the discussion about law enforcement, and then Justice Earls will take the lead on the second half of the discussion, which is about the courts and beyond. We've had a series of these regional roundtables. They have been incredibly helpful for our work, hearing the perspectives of people who have interacted with the criminal justice system in one way or another. You may work there or you may have been engaged by it. So it will inform the work we do in the coming weeks and months. We're incredibly grateful to each of you for taking the time today. And at this point, I'll hand it off to Justice Earls for any preliminary comments she may like to offer.
Thank you, Attorney General Stein. Hi, everyone. I'm Anita Earls. I am enormously grateful to you for being with us this morning. Your input comes at a crucial time in our process. The working groups have begun to do their work, but we wanted to have these listening sessions in order to both have a more in-depth interactive process of getting input and feedback. So we have had and are going to have more public hearings where people have 2 minutes to speak. Our next public hearing will be in the evening, Thursday, September 3rd, and people who want to speak at that public hearing, anyone across the state can sign up at the website that was in the chat. But I think that this is really an incredibly useful opportunity to have some interaction, some back and forth. So I hope all of you will feel free to participate. And the other reason for doing this is to get some sense of regional differences. I mean, we know that in our state that there are some important differences between urban and rural areas. What happens in Wilmington is not always the same as what happens in Asheville. So it's a big state, and it has been really useful to hear what is going on in your community and what some of your experiences have been with the criminal justice system and with efforts to make changes or improvements. The other thing I want to emphasize is that the governor has given us a very short period of time to make recommendations by December 1st, and then the other year and a half of our work is intended to foster the implementation of those recommendations. So the task force is not just about talking, it's not just about change for change's sake. So we are really looking for solutions that are proven, that can make a difference. And so your input on that is really crucial. And finally, what that means, the governor gave us a very defined mission that we are to develop and help implement solutions that will eliminate disparate outcomes in the criminal justice system that are based on race. But he didn't give us a magic wand. So we can't just wave our hands and make things happen. It's really all of you. And it's the work that you continue to do in your communities that can make the difference. And so with that, I will turn it back to Attorney General Stein to get us started on the policing issues.
Thank you very much, Justice Earls. And I want to recognize one of members of your community, Deborah Dix Maxwell, who is listening in and participating this morning. And she has graciously agreed to the governor's request to serve on this task force. And she's from Wilmington. And then, of course, we have Sheriff Ingram from neighboring Brunswick County. He is also a participant, and we appreciate their help. And Deborah, of course, feel free to weigh in at any point in the conversation today. I'd like to talk about law enforcement first. And is Pastor Barnett on yet? He may be joining us momentarily if he's not here. Rebecca, are you on? I'm having trouble with my Zoom. Okay, she may join us as well. And Jermaine Armour, Pastor Armour?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Wonderful. I was just wondering if you would offer some comments on this issue of law enforcement and their relationship with the community and things that we need to work on. Anything you think that's going right?
Thank you, Attorney General. I think that all over, wherever we are in our world, the relationship between law enforcement and the community has not really been good historically. So the work, I think, is for us to try to change that and implement some change over time. As it was just stated, we don't have a magic wand. So we have to change that. One of the things I think that will change that is something that Clifford Barnett would always talk about, is building relationships with the community. And I think one of the first things to do that is to be visible in our community. So the more that we see our law enforcement can be visible in a way where they're not coming to actually arrest anyone or search for anyone or look for anyone, but just to be present is going to make a very big difference. We have a ministry at our church where we serve about 100 people every week. and the presence of law enforcement there. My church is on the south side, so that's considered one of the hood areas of Wilmington. But the presence of the law enforcement there does bring a little calm. It does add a little sense of control when they're there. And just to see the officers interact with people in the community that they already know is something that is working. So that is being done. You know, the Bible says the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. So it's a lot of work that can be done. So to see more officers do that, I think that will build some great relationships. I know I only got a couple of minutes, but I was granted the opportunity to go through a police simulation here a couple of weeks ago to go over some police policy in lieu of what happened to George Floyd. To go over the policy was good. We got to ask a lot of questions. It was some things that we were concerned about, but to see it on an objective scale with the use of force and the things that police officers have to think about and what the community is seeing was great dialogue. That's going to take more than 3 minutes, but I thought it was great to have the community a part of that. And then I went through a simulation when it comes to use of force and shooting with the police officers. And I tell you, it kind of changed my perspective or gave me a little bit of more understanding of how challenging it is when things like this are confronted with police officers and those in the community. I'm still trying to figure out how my emotions are about that, because I believe in supporting life and pursuing life and protecting life. And that's the first thing I believe that every police officer should think about. And even on the policy training, the whole pursuit of protecting life, to me, linguistically came at the bottom when I wanted to kind of see that more at the top. So we have a lot of work to do. And on the side of being a person in the community, as we're asking the police officers to change some things and change some policies and change their approach, I think as a pastor in the community, a person of faith, is my job to be in the community, building relationships with the community and making sure that the guys that are getting arrested and getting in trouble are not committing crimes. So we have to provide other things for them to do. So it's work on both ends that we have to do. But I think that if we work together, I know that change will come.
Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
Pastor Nesbitt, do you have any preliminary thoughts you would like to share as well?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for recognizing me. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. I don't want us to paint law enforcement, first of all, with such a broad brush, because I know more honorable and great law enforcement officers than I know those that are troubled. But I also recognize that there's a culture that exists. I know we're saying now that a junior officer should report a senior officer if he acts out of control. That's going to be difficult to comply with, because you're trained to respect your senior officers to such a degree. So unless we're going to, in my opinion, video everything, video, audio, everything, and then make it public to a panel that it can be reviewed, that the culture itself is going to still protect those that are out of control. And I think that's one of our major issues. We've got to be able to rein in those that are out of control. And so far, the things we're stating are not going to work. Most of the problems we have is going to come from economics, which hinders education, which limits positions in society. And until we begin to get captains and chiefs and commanders that look more like the community, we're always going to have a problem policing the community. So it's a broad problem, and we've got to deal with it in a different vein than rather attacking a segment, whether it be law enforcement or the neighborhood. We've got to deal with it in a broader way if we're going to bring everything into a reasonable realm. That's about it for me.
Thank you very much, Pastor. Yeah, I think you hit on a really critical point, which is it's one thing to change the rules, but you also have to work on the culture of law enforcement to help create an environment where they're public servants, they are peace officers. They're bringing peace to the community. Obviously, they're enforcing the law when it is being violated, and they're protecting people who are at risk of harm. And so accountability is going to be something that this task force spends a great deal of time wrestling with, because I think accountability is one critical way by which you can change culture. So thank you for that. And I see Rebecca is here. Pleasure to have you. I wanted to offer the floor to you to offer some comments on law enforcement, use of force, any of these topics you'd like to discuss.
Thank you so much for having me. So I am concerned about use of force, and from what I understand right now, it's not essential or it's not mandatory to track these numbers by race. Am I understanding that correctly?
Actually, we'll have Deputy Chief Sarvis address that when he talks in a moment, if you would, Deputy.
Okay. So when it comes to use of force, I feel like there's a breakdown in accountability with the community, and it seems like it's impossible to actually to really effectively challenge use of force because of qualified immunity. At the end of the day, if an officer is not really going to be held accountable for his actions because they're going to get off anyway, there's really, I don't see how we could really, what we have to rein that kind of behavior in. I'm very concerned about that. I didn't really know about qualified immunity until this George Floyd came about. And, you know, I talked to Mr. David about this before, and it's like, you can lose a civil case. I'm sorry, you can have no criminal charges that stick to an officer, but they could still have to pay up in civil court. And so obviously, if there's wrongdoing, they need to be held accountable. And, you know, I think about, you know, like if you have a right to carry, you have the right to carry, you have a concealed carry permit. If I shoot somebody in the back leaving my house, guess who's in trouble? I am. However, if an officer does that, are there any consequences? Not that I've seen across the country. And so I feel like if we're going to train officers, if we need, and they should be held to a higher standard. And right now, I don't think that they are. Also, we've talked a lot in our community about citizen review boards. And the problem with that is that without subpoena power, they don't have to tell you anything. And I've studied the Charlotte-Mecklenburg CRB that's been in place for about 20 years. And very few times have they have never really been able to overturn a decision that was made by the police department. And so if we're going to have, I would like to have a citizens review board, because that would give us the opportunity to engage with our law enforcement bodies, hold them accountable, but also participate and say, hey guys, I've actually looked at everything, and the 12 of us, or I'm sorry, the 11 of us, we all think that this was right, or we think it's wrong and we can actually do something about it.
Those are very helpful comments, Rebecca. Thank you. Yeah. So it actually segued very well on Pastor Nesbitt's comments about changing the culture requires new forms of accountability. One thing that was interesting is we had a conversation with Chief Davis, who is in Durham, and they have a citizens review board there. And it turned out that the recommendations that the police did on internal affairs actually was the same as whatever the recommendation the citizen review board had done. And we had kind of two reactions to that. One is the police, knowing that there was a citizens review board looking over their shoulder, may have been more rigorous in their discipline. But two, the fact that the citizens review board agreed with the determinations of the local police, it meant that the community had more faith that whatever the adjudication was the appropriate one. And so I think that there's a lot of richness with the citizen review board notion, and we are definitely considering both that and the qualified immunity issue as part of the work of this task force. Appreciate your comments. I see Pastor Barnett has been able to join us this morning. I wanted to see if you wanted to offer some preliminary thoughts on this issue of law enforcement and how it can build faith with the community.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. It took me a minute to find my emails to get to you, but
You're not the
I
only
think
one. I've got on at 10:01, so I
okay,
apologize.
good, thanks. Number one, I love what the police are doing. I think that part of what has to happen to improve relationships is, of course, building relationships. It's just building relationships. The one illustration I want to share is a few Sundays ago, well before COVID-19. One of the parishioners in my church was a 35-year-old police officer, and he retired. So I had 30 years he retired, and I had about 35 kids in front of me doing a children's sermon, and I brought him up, and I said, because police are our friends. These are our friends. This is our friend. And I said, how many of you know that the policeman is your friend? And only about 3 of the kids raised their hands.
Hmm.
And that struck me because I grew up in a time where you went to the police were your friends. And so I like to see us get back to that, and that's through building relationships. And I think we have to start it at small, and I think then the other thing that made me think about this was because those kids, and these were kids under 18, most of those kids under 18, much of what they've seen about police officers was in a negative light. So that may give them the rationale why they would think that policemen aren't our friends. But I'd like to see us work on that from that aspect.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's very critical that we recruit the right people into law enforcement, that we train them properly, and we give them realistic objectives. I mean, one problem I think with law enforcement today is that we put all of our social ills on the police. Like our healthcare system is failing. People don't have health insurance, so they're not getting mental health care. Our substance use disorder treatment is lacking. I mean, the Coastal Horizons is a wonderful facility, but so many people don't have health insurance, so they can't get treatment for their addiction. And so we're asking police to be social workers, to be drug counselors, to be mental health counselors. And that's just too much for any one profession to bear. And I think we need to think differently about how we respond to public crises. Greensboro just started a new program and 2 months ago. Very excited to see how it develops, where when the call comes into 911, they will send out a police officer and a social worker, or a police officer and a mental health counselor to respond to the crisis, because the police officer goes and secures the scene to make sure that there's no one who is at physical risk. And once that has happened, the police officer then steps back, and then the mental health counselor, who has a professional background in dealing with people in crisis, then steps to the fore. And so that's a kind of re-envisioning of public safety that I'm very excited to see how it develops, and something that we may consider to recommend to folks statewide. Deputy Chief Sarvis, I very much appreciate your being on this morning. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Wanted to see if you had comments on any of these issues: recruitment, training, community relations. We welcome your participation.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'll start off with saying about recruitment. It is very important to get the right officers. And I can appreciate what Pastor Nesbitt talked about as far as having, and I believe it was Pastor Nesbitt, having the department look like the community, because I think that's very key. We tried very diligently here to recruit the right officers, and it is so important to have those officers with the right training. And one of the other aspects I want to talk about is retainability. Law enforcement recently has been painted with a broad brush. And once again, Pastor Nesbitt, I think, talked about that. I will tell you, 99% of the officers that I come in contact with that I have known over my career, and I've been doing this for 28 and a half years, are 100% great officers who care, give back to the community, want to do the right things. So then that brings to the question, what do you do with the 1%? The 1% out there that you're like we saw in the George Floyd situation. Those are the individuals I don't want in my career field. Those are individuals no one wants in any career field that will be treating people like that. So we've got to hit that with the proper resiliency training for the retainability aspect for our officers. One of the things, a lot of the things that we've seen in the last few months, and that was sparked from the George Floyd incident, is a lot of our young officers seeing people, say all kinds of, if you will, ungodly things to them, calling them murderers and stuff like that. And these are officers that's got 1 or 2 years of experience in law enforcement, and they're having a hard time handling that aspect of it. So we've really tried to build the resiliency there. So absolutely, we need diversity training, implicit bias training, and we're giving that to our officers. Here at the Sheriff's Office over the last 10 years, Sheriff McMahon has made it a point to have that type of training, and we have had diversity and sensitivity training. We've had training called The Color of Justice, training called Positively Impacting Today's Youth, and Verbal De-escalation. We've had a lot of this training over the last 10 years. It's a whole long list. I know I don't have much time, but I just wanted to talk about that. And it's very interesting. Several of the individuals have already spoken, talked about relationships. I believe it's so important. The 3 R's to being successful in law enforcement today is relationships, relationships, and relationships. And it is very important for us to build those. They do not, and when I say they, I'm talking about the community, does not need to see us for the first time when something happens bad in our community. We've got to have relationships, building relationships with local pastors, local NAACP, local community leaders who have influence with the community, who are already respected by the community. They can help us build that same respect in our community. And I think if we work diligently, and I think we've done a really good job here, there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot of room to increase that professionalism and the training and the different things and the relationships that we've already have, but we can always build on that and increase that. So that's just a little bit I wanted just to share because I know my time is limited, but we're in it for the long haul to make our community better, make our law enforcement better, and working with each and many of the individuals that's on this panel today.
Chief Deputy Sarvis, thank you. Give my best to Sheriff McMahon. I forgot to say at the beginning of my comments, I certainly pray and hope that everybody got through the hurricane as well as possible. I know that created a great deal of work for Sheriff McMahon and Sheriff Ingram. So thanks so much. I see my good friend, District Attorney Ben David is with us. And I know we're going to draw on your experience in the second part of the discussion as it relates to the courts, but I know that you have thoughts on these issues. So I wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in on the law enforcement questions.
Thank you, Attorney General Stein, and Justice Earls, thank you for your leadership as well, and good morning, everyone. I want to start by thanking so many of you who are listening for really helping keep the peace. We're not like any other community in that we have a different history here, Josh. You probably know about 1898. It's Wilmington's lie. And we have profound issues around race that stretch long before any of us were even born or lived here. I will say that at the height of the protests that were sweeping the country, and some cities were on fire and some weren't, it was many of the pastors who are listening right now, many of the law enforcement officers who I advise, all came together on June 4th in front of our 1898 memorial and joined together in, I think, a very powerful show of unity and said, we choose community, we don't choose chaos, as Dr. King said. And I think that really set the tone for let's move forward together on this issue. This should not be political. I know that, as I talk, people are probably saying, he's a politician. To me, race and justice is a sleeping giant in the criminal justice system. It has been for years. Most of the work of our office, and my first assistant, Barrett Temple, Rosetta Royster from Pender County are on here. I'll just give you one brief example of what we've been doing just in the last few days. We're dealing with mass dismissals of cases where we don't want people coming to the courthouse just to show us their registration and inspection violations, or that they didn't have a license in their possession, but they are licensed, or they didn't have the right paperwork, but now they do. We've dismissed literally 7,000 cases that way without people needing to come to court. That overwhelmingly affects people of color because it's really a poverty issue in many cases why people aren't paying off fines and court costs. We went back and looked at 2 years worth of cases where hundreds and hundreds, thousands even of cases where people couldn't pay these fines were revoking their licenses. And so we're working with Daniel Bowes and Frankie Roberts, who's on the line, and the Second Chances Alliance to say, let's remove that impediment to getting your license back. And those are thousands of cases that we're talking about. I know that good work is going on in other communities like Durham and Greensboro. And so there's these statewide efforts right now to say, by looking at poverty and looking at fines and court costs, we're also looking at the disproportionate impact on communities of color. We keep those statistics to answer some of the questions out there about, who's in our jail and why. And we look at that every day with our bonds. We are doing a whole lot right now with expanding expungement relief. We are the district that started expungement clinics in this state because we want people to get that scarlet letter removed when they're eligible under the law. I worked with Senator Floyd McKissick, and it came out during pandemic, but it predated it. We worked on the most expansive Second Chances Act in the country to get people's record cleaned up automatically where they didn't have to apply through a private attorney to do that. And so we think there's a great amount of work that can be done that, again, overwhelmingly impacts people who are living in poverty, but also happens to have an impact on the Black community, the Hispanic community. And so we want to continue to work with those efforts in the court system. We think that will really move the needle. And we do not want to change the subject. We think police use of force is what got us into this conversation with the murder of George Floyd, and I'm calling it that. I was in Minneapolis last weekend, by the way, and talking to some of those people who have lived there for years. I believe we can do a whole lot more than we are to assure the community that there's transparency here and that when those cases occur, there's a way forward. And I'll be glad to talk about, and I invite my prosecutors who are on the line to talk about some of the initiatives we have in place for that.
That's great. Thank you so much. And we'll talk more about the courts and those discretionary decisions and the second part of our discussion. I did want to build on something that Chief Deputy Sarvis mentioned about recruitment, that you want to make sure that you have a law enforcement personnel that reflects the diversity of the community, but you also want to recruit the right type of personality. I mean, there are a couple personalities that are drawn to law enforcement. You've got the guardian who wants to go out there and protect people, care for people. I retweeted a remarkable video yesterday from Twitter where this police officer sprinted and got this man on a wheelchair and pulled him off the train tracks literally 1 second before the train went zooming by. I mean, she just clearly was driven by her care for fellow man. But then there are other people who are drawn to it because of the warrior. They like having a gun and busting in doors. And we got to make sure that we're getting the right personalities into the profession. And then we then support them with the right training. And Rebecca put a comment in here about making sure that that is interdisciplinary, that they learn crisis intervention training, but they also are supplemented by other people who have those skill sets as well. We've got about 10 minutes left for the first part of our discussion here on law enforcement. I want to open it up for people to talk for maybe 60 to 90 seconds. And if you would like to do so, make sure your video is on so I can see you. And all you have to do is just wave to the screen and I'll call on you and you can share your thoughts. Yeah, back to you, Pastor Barnett.
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned the two kinds of officers that that are attracted to policemen. What do you do when you find one that is power crazy, gun crazy? How do we help him to become the right kind of cop or a better cop? Or how because, for example, with George Floyd, those guys have been on the force, some of them for 20 years.
Yeah.
So
and what's sad is
in
that
place?
what was sad is that the ones around them had only been on the
Yeah,
force.
we rookies.
Rookies, yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's what they're being acculturated to, seeing this kind of
Right.
dehumanized interaction. And that starts to weigh on a person and change them. Chief Deputy Sarvis, how do you handle that when you find somebody who's a little bit too eager to bust down the door? How do you rein in that enthusiasm or excess attitude?
Absolutely. Good question there. We have a very thorough process through our recruitment, and we analyze psychologicals, polygraphs. We use a outside entity to do all of that, and through our background checks, we kind of try to focus on what their demeanor is like, trying to get the right person. So once we hire the person and we start seeing some red flags, if you will, what we do, we have a personnel early warning system. It's called PEWS. And if they start having a use of force that's not justified, then we evaluate that, look at it. And if it was if it was excessive and to the point where it concerned us to the point where we may just go ahead and let them go. But we're not in the business of collecting a whole lot of red flags here at the sheriff's office. If we start getting a lot of red flags, we might have the opportunity to tell that young man or that young woman that this may not be the career for you. And I'll tell you, that's exactly what we're going to do. But we try to give them the right training and focus them in the right direction. You've got to be careful who your training officers are. They're in the George Floyd. That guy had, if it's correct and what I heard, 18 different incidents of excessive use of force. Law enforcement agencies and administrators can't stand for that. They've got to have accountability. And that's why we have a PEWS system that highlights anytime we start having an officer that seems to have confrontations, we bring them in, we evaluate it, we look at it. We have a use of force board that looks at each and every one to make sure that the use of force that was done was correct. So we got to keep our finger on the pulse, and that's what agencies have to do. And not speaking against another agency, but somehow this guy stayed too long, in my opinion, in Minneapolis.
And one thing we've heard from, I'll come to you in a moment, Pastor Armour. One thing that we've heard in other of these regional roundtables and the public sessions that we've had is that folks want to make sure that if a New Hanover County Sheriff's Office dismisses a deputy for excessive force, that they can't then go to Pender or Bladen and get hired. And so we got to make sure that we don't have cracks in the system so that
absolutely.
People,
and that's where I'm sorry, go ahead. I was going to say that's where our sheriff's standards and training comes in. And when we let go of, release someone, fire someone for that type of activity, our sheriff's training and standards highlights that. And before they can get recertified, they could lose their certification. So we have some checks and balances there. I think it needs to be improved, though, for sure.
Wonderful. I'll go to Pastor Armour and then District Attorney David.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to bring some redress to what Deputy Ken said, who's really, really great in our community. I know him very well. Just some redress to relationships. I mean, when I tell you that we have to continue to build relationships between police and community. I'm Gen X, and growing up in Buffalo, New York, every Black kid in the hood wanted to be a fireman or a cop. That's Gen X. Millennials do not. This generation, they don't want to be cops or want to be sheriffs. They don't want to be police officers, especially in the Black community. They want to stay as far away from police officers as they can. That's just the reality, because that 1% that Deputy Ken is talking about, that's the thing that's getting publicized. That's what's on television. There are a whole bunch of officers, I truly believe, I share the sentiment of my friend Clifford Barnett, that are doing great, probably more than are doing great than that 1%, but that's not being seen. And so what's being seen is the George Floyd situation. And still to this day, if an African-American, even myself, all of my stuff is legit in my car. I'm not, as they say, riding dirty, but everything is up to point. But if an officer pulls behind me, there's a certain adrenaline that goes to me, and all of my stuff is legit in the car. but that's because of what we've seen. So it took a while to get from Gen X, when every Black kid wanted to be a cop, to now millennials want to stay away from cops. It took a while to tear that down. My grandmother used to call the cops, she didn't even call them police officers. She called them authorities. I'm going to call the authorities. That's how much respect that law enforcement used to have in community. But just like the moral voice in the church or in the Black community has gone, that respect for law enforcement has gone. So I wanted to bring redress to how relationship is going to play such a good part. And when I left the training, the simulation training for the Women's Police Department, and the officers there were amazing. We had a great time. But one of the things they said to me is that, listen, if you have more people, you know, of color, tell them that, you know, we're looking for good police officers. That ain't the conversation right now that I can have with the African-American community. They ain't trying to join the police officer right now. They're not trying to join the force right now because of what they're seeing, but they will once we begin to build relationships, and that's going to take some time. As it took some time to take it from authorities, how we looked at officers during the 70s and the 80s, to how we see officers now, that took a lot to break that down. It's going to take a lot to build it up, and so I bring redress to relationship building, and I think that's going to be the first stage. Because I don't want us to say, well, we're doing an initiative on recruit, but Pastor, won't nobody of color join? They're not going to join right now. We got to do some building relationships first. And then once we build relationships and show the great things that are happening between officers and community, then I think you'll have more recruits. And we may be able to get that spark again with somebody of color says, hey,
I'm
I
so
want to be
sorry
a
to
police
cut you off,
officer.
but we're
Sorry.
just got
Okay.
a few minutes left.
Okay.
I'll
Thank you.
I'll just reinforce what you said. Relationships, any healthy relationship is based on trust, and trust is earned, and that takes time. It's not anything you can flip a switch to make it happen. You have to earn it. District Attorney David.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. Obviously, integrity and accountability has to start with us in the criminal justice system. And years ago, we implemented a policy here in my district called the Giglio policy. I know that you're aware of what that is, but just for the benefit of everyone listening, and specific answer to the question about what do we do with the bad cop, who's the outlier, who is tarnishing the badge, who all of us should want to drum out of the ranks and not allow themselves to be reinvented on another side of the state in another community that might not know about what they just did. What we do is, if there's an officer, not who's just committed a crime, that's easy. A background check is available to everyone. But if they have either on-duty or off-duty conduct, like the gentleman who killed Mr. Floyd, he should have never worn the badge in light of his conduct. He should have been fired years ago and should not have been allowed to be rehired anywhere. If that were to happen in my district, if there's a crime or if there's an issue involving moral turpitude, in other words, their credibility, or if there's a specific allegation of profiling, Barrett Temple, who's my first assistant DA on the line, runs what's called the Giglio Committee. We reach out to 20 different police agencies. That's over 1,000 officers in my district, to their internal affairs division. And if anyone has on-duty or off-duty conduct that falls into those categories, my office reviews it. If it rises to the level that we can no longer trust their word as a witness, or we believe that they're profiling, we've had cases like this, we not only meet with that officer and say, we're never allowing you to testify again, but we write a letter to the sheriff or the chief that employs them and saying, we can't make you fire them. We're just telling you we are never calling them as a witness. They usually fire them as a result. We then send a copy to training and standards. For the sheriff's offices, they have a training and standards that's different than the police agencies in the state. We send it to both. And we say, here's our internal file if you need it. We are asking you not to rehire this person if they try to move to Asheville. And you can feel free to call us and we'll let you know what we knew about that officer. I chair the Best Practices Committee for the Conference of DAs, and that is a statewide effort. We are all trying to get on the same page with saying these officers who are tarnishing the badge should not be rehired somewhere else if they have been drummed out of the law enforcement by their local sheriff, DA, or chief of police.
Thank you, Ben. Yep, Rebecca.
Thank you. I just have like a couple of suggestions. You asked us how we can get better officers. I do think that there is an aspect of culture that has to be addressed that other people have touched on. I was an EMT. I was a first responder for 5 years, and not too long ago, I will say that it is a culture thing. I would like to say that it is a few bad apples, but I think it's more than that. I do think that we do have a toxic culture that does have to be addressed, and people who are I could tell you from having responded that they were either the best of the best and they were keeping me safe and they were the only thing between me and a bad day, or they were taking things to 100 and I was putting out the fire. I have responded to law enforcement officer involved shootings, and I know what that looks like. I've been there. So I am not on the crowd that will say that it's a few bad apples. I do believe that it's a toxic culture that does have to be addressed, but there are some amazing people in there, and most of them really are good people, but we do have to address the culture itself. I could say a lot about that, but I won't. I think that we need to demilitarize. I think that we should train our officers not to see the civilians or citizens as people who are scary, but they're civilians to be protected rather than combatants, because we're not combatants. I think that we need to have, while I said CIT before, crisis intervention training for our officers, I also think that we need to take care of the mental health of the officers themselves, prevent PTSD, help them navigate the stress that they deal with on the job. And I would want to call that resiliency training regimen. It's not optional, it's just part of what you do. And when we have our JPAT, our job physical agility test, and our physicals every year, we should probably also go and have a mental evaluation to make sure that we're handling the stress and adapting. I think that we also need to think about 4-year degrees. What about having 4-year?
I'm so sorry, I have to cut you off. We're right at the very end of the lightning round.
Sure.
Rebecca, those were very helpful comments. I saw that Mr. DeQuan Peters had raised his hand online and wanted to give him a chance to offer comments as well. I have to take yourself off of mute, Mr. Peters.
Yeah, I would like to pretty much piggyback off of what everyone else was saying about the relationships. And it was something that Sheriff said about 99% of the officers that he's worked with were good officers. So I want to give you a perspective from somebody who's directly impacted from the community, been in the community for all his life, formerly incarcerated. And in our mindset, 99% of the officers that we encounter are bad. And that's just how it is. I come from an era where we had certain officers that lived in the projects with us, like Lincoln, Waddell, different officers that lived in the community with us. They would talk to us, they would engage us, they would be out there. You don't see that today unless they're coming to either arrest you, harass you, or something to that nature. Also, I would like to say, you can't bridge that gap if there is no trust. You can't think about building trust with anyone if you constantly on a daily basis doing things to the community that you don't want to trust, that you can't build no trust. And like the brother said, I might be totally legit, and if the police get behind me and don't even pull me over, I'm shaking, I'm nervous, and don't too many things do that to me. We're living in a culture right now where we got to indict the mindset of those individuals. And you can't think that you're going to do that in 2-3 conversations. You can't do that in a year. You're not going to be able to do that in 2 years, in my opinion. The kids today, they, like he said, they don't trust the police because they see the police locking their fathers up. They see the police doing all of these things to them. Another thing, when it comes to the military equipment, if you're going to give these officers military equipment, then you got to give them the same training and escalation of force training as those. They got to be held accountable the same way if a war was going on and someone did something that had no business doing in a war, they're still going to get in trouble for it. Nobody is getting in trouble for what they're doing. And this just didn't happen with George Floyd. And you have a lot of people that has been went through this, and for years and years and years, no one has done nothing about it. But now that is really, really a major thing going on. People want to step up and say something, but then tomorrow you'll go through the neighborhoods and see the same officers acting in the same way. And then you want to come to the community and say, hey, look, we want to build trust. Hey, look, we want to do this. You see the sheriff come through the community. You see the police come through the community. And then we can have it. Then we can have it. I'm telling you, that's what they're doing. I see it every day. I see it every day. And you can't build trust with people that's going to do that. That's why kids don't want to be police officers no more. I come from an era where kids want to grow up to be police officers, firefighters, EMS, all these type of things, but they're not doing it. There's no transparency for one. You tell us one thing, and then behind closed doors, you do something totally different. That's not trustful. The officers that just got fired from the Wilmington Police Department or wherever they got fired from, how long they been on the force? So that's a mindset that's been going on for years. And nothing happened to them. If I communicate a threat to say I'm going to kill the police, they'll be kicking my door down tomorrow. He communicated a threat to saying that he's going to kill black people and do all of these things, nothing happened to him. But get fired. We don't even know if he's getting his pension. We don't know any of these things. Nobody is telling us nothing. So how are we supposed to trust anybody that's in law enforcement? You do have good officers. I'm not painting a bad picture on all officers. You do have good officers. But predominantly, most of the people that we deal in the county are bad to us. And that's coming from somebody who's been dealing with the criminal justice system for over 20-something years. A lot of the charges that I went to prison for, I should have never went to prison for. But at the end of the day, we got to be able to learn how to communicate with each other and come together and say, okay, here's how it's going to go. Here's what we need to do, and stick to that, and don't go back and then try to change things up and bring it back to the community and think that we're supposed to automatically go with whatever you say do. It don't always work like that.
I'm so sorry, I have to cut you off now. We're at the very end of the lightning round, I believe.
Mr. Peters, thank you. I want to thank you for your comments very much. I mean, the points you raise are why this task force was created by the governor. And to fix the problems cannot happen overnight. And there isn't a single solution to them. What it is it's going to be multiple solutions at every stage of the process. And that's what we're committed to trying to do. And so really appreciate your joining us today and sharing your perspective. At this time, I'll hand it off to my co-chair, Anita Earls, and she'll talk about the second part of our criminal justice system once people enter the courthouse.
Right. Thank you so much. I want to make sure that we don't forget to mention the fact that a large number of the task force members you don't see them on the screen, but they are watching as we are talking there on, and they can join in if they want to raise their hands. But I didn't want you to think that I wanted everyone to be assured that a large proportion of the task force is watching this right now, and it's also posted so that other folks can watch it later if they're not available right now. So you are being heard, is that point. I wanted to just quickly follow up, if I may, and I'm not sure if we have everyone we need to answer this, but the initial question about use of force reporting, I know that North Carolina was one of the first states to keep traffic stop data by race, and that we now have 10 years of, more than 10 years of data on traffic stops by law enforcement agencies across the state. But Ms. Trammell initially raised this question of, do we keep use of force data by race in a way that the public can have not necessarily identifying information, but can have access to that. And I'll note that District Attorney David also talked about how keeping data on the systems is key to his efforts to trying to address these issues. So maybe we've lost Chief Deputy Sarvis. But I was hoping we could, oh, there you are, you're there, sorry. Can you address this question of use of force data?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, use of force data, what our primary focus is whether the use of force is justified. We don't track it as far as ethnicity, if it was a, Black, Hispanic, white, or what have you. We just look at whether the use of force was justified or not. Traffic stops absolutely do, and you just mentioned that over the last 10 years, we do track that.
Well, that is helpful for us to know, and I think we've heard that at other listening sessions as something to be looking at. So thank you for that information.
Yes, ma'am.
And so I shouldn't give short shrift to the whole court system issues, because it is a crucial part of the criminal justice system, and there are 2 working groups dedicated to those issues, and they are wide ranging. So I want to start with Dr. Kim Cook, who can address us about pretrial release, bail, and also school resource officers. The juvenile justice system is also a part of what we're looking at. So Dr. Cook, please.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be part of this group and to be listening in on this discussion. My entry point into this conversation comes as a professional scholar. I'm a professor at UNCW in sociology and criminology. On a personal level, I'm also a crime survivor, having been through the ordeal of domestic violence in my life and sexual violence in my life. And so for me, the issues of crime and justice are personal and professional. The pretrial issues that I'd like to see us do a lot better on, include using more restorative justice practices to divert away from courts and away from incarceration. So restorative justice practices work best, in my opinion, and the research shows, when they are trauma informed and when they are resiliency focused, in terms of building resiliency within the community as well as resiliency within individuals. So I'd like to see us use more sentencing circles, use more diversionary programs like teen court and drug court and those types of things. I think that there's a lot more that we can be doing with regard to restorative justice as it relates to racial justice. I think it's time for here in New Hanover County for us to have a truth and reconciliation conversation about the events that District Attorney David brought up with regard to the 1898 massacre and the ongoing and continuing impact of that. I think it's time for us to have a serious conversation as well around how to do a better job at making the economy available to people who are poor. When people who are poor are locked out of the economy or have barriers to participating in the legitimate economy, the option available to them is the illegal economy and the black market. And that is an economy that's regulated by the use of violence. And we see that erupting and emerging in our communities. So I'd like to see us invest more in restorative economics as well. So restorative economics would be the types of small businesses and larger businesses that deliberately and explicitly do the type of hiring that help give people opportunities that are typically and traditionally blocked out of the economy. The business here in the area that I'm thinking of is the Fox's Boxes on 4th Street, which is a restaurant that has an externship program to train people into the legitimate economy for those that are having trouble maybe aging out of foster care system and don't have other types of programs available. So restorative economics, I think, restorative justice practices have been shown to be very effective at reducing reoffending rates for young offenders, have also shown to have a lot more victim satisfaction than traditional systems of punishment. And I wouldn't be a professor if I didn't give you all some homework. So I'm going to give you homework right now, and that is to read this book, Until We Reckon, by Danielle Sered. It is about violence, mass incarceration, and the road to repair. Danielle Sered runs a nonprofit organization in Brooklyn that uses restorative justice to provide decent justice services for people who've been impacted by crime. The phrase that I like to use in restorative justice is that if crime is about injury, then justice should be about healing. And we know that that injury is often related to histories of trauma. And so restorative justice needs to be trauma informed, resiliency focused, aware of and combating implicit bias and racial bias, and also rooted in the communities in which we are serving each other for the greater good of the community. We also need to do more, and Link is a great organization here in town that does restorative reentry for people coming home after incarceration. So I want to give a shout out to Frankie Roberts for the great work that Link is doing. I also, in full disclosure, I chair the board of directors of Link. And I also serve on the board of directors of a national nonprofit based here in North Carolina called the Healing Justice Project, which provides restorative justice-based services and peer support services for people who've been directly impacted by wrongful convictions. So exonerees as well as original crime victims. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you. I want to just follow up and ask you, from your perspective, what are the barriers or sort of the structural or institutional reasons why that are hindering greater use of the restorative justice practices that you're talking about?
So I've been working a lot in the community over the last 5 years, helping to cultivate more restorative practices. So I've been working I've taken some cases in the juvenile court system for the public defender's office and for the prosecutor's office over the last several years. And I've also been doing a lot of training with school teachers and to build more restorative practices in the public schools. I think the first barrier is just not knowing about it. Once people learn about restorative practices, they start thinking about the ideas that drive it and the techniques that we use, and they realize that there's a lot of value to that for community building, for cultivating positive behavior as a way of preventing troublesome or harmful behavior. So I think awareness is one of the things. And then another maybe obstacle to it or a hurdle for it is people get really stuck in the mindset that punishment is the only form of accountability. And if you read this book, Until We Reckon, you will see that accountability is a much broader issue than simply holding somebody incarcerated for a period of time. So we need to do a better job of making active accountability part of our conversation, where people actually make active amends to the person that they harmed as a byproduct of and as a requirement within restorative practices. So I think it's awareness and people being sort of devoted to or stuck in the current system.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So let me turn, District Attorney David, I know you've already told us a lot about what you are doing and what but I do want you to talk to us a little bit more about racial disparity in the court system. And I'll tell you that the working group looking at this has been also considering things like adopting Washington State's rule on Batson challenges, so to change the way the court system handles jury selection as an effort to try to make our juries more diverse, and as well as looking at sentencing, and so really the whole range of everything that happens in the criminal justice system. And I would love to hear from you about what this task force can do from your perspective to further your efforts, because it does sound like you're doing a lot already.
Thank you. Well, one thing that I really compliment the Attorney General on, and this task force in general, is really looking at bonds. Because of course, people are presumed innocent under our Fifth Amendment, and they are held prior to trial in many cases because of bonds that they can't make. We look at who's in our jail. And so just to give you some statistics, because you asked specifically about them, our population in New Hanover County, just as an example, is approximately 18% African American, yet it's 54% of our jail. So that's a 3-to-1, what we call disproportionate minority contact. Every day, what we do, and Ken Sarvis can certainly speak to this, is they have a sheriff's representative who physically works in my office right across the hall from my physical office, who monitors the jail and says, if there's a person who's there for inability to pay, juvenile, homeless person, someone who's there on a minor charge that's nonviolent, we work to get them out of custody because we need that jail space, particularly in this time of the pandemic, for violent criminals and career criminals. We don't want people there who are simply languishing because of inability to pay. As it relates to violent crime, in the 16 years I've been the district attorney here in Wilmington, 8 out of 10 of our murder victims have been people of color, and the vast majority are below the poverty line. And they demographically mirror their shooters and killers. And so we call it the mirror image rule. So we have a lot of work to do as a community, I believe, in honestly confronting that issue. I tell people when I go out and talk at Rotary clubs, we need to stop rethinking of this as high crime areas and look at them as high victim areas. When you talk about public housing projects and the like, the people who are growing up in our youth enrichment zone are generally struggling with where's their next meal coming from. And so it's hard to learn. We reduce violent crime by 25% for our kids in that region simply by increasing graduation rates by that same number. So we really worked a lot with area educators, particularly young people. Rebecca and others have mentioned it, Kimberly as well, but we have a resiliency task force that's really looking at the true gateway drug to the heroin epidemic, which is childhood trauma, and how we're focusing on the toxic stress that's particularly impacting communities of color because of the economic disparities and the structural inequalities and just the racism that's out there in the world. And so we think that it's important, to treat everyone equally, obviously, and equal protection means you don't differentiate on any of the things that we could talk about. But in terms of keeping these statistics, it's important to know where we are having the greatest impact when we make certain changes to our system, particularly again around the issues of inability to pay, because I think that is disproportionately impacting the Black community.
So I'm glad you brought us back to the issue of economic inequality. And I wanted to make sure everyone is aware, of course, that the governor has appointed another task force, the Andrea Harris Task Force, that is trying to address some of those issues. So, and I think it's fair to say that we understand that the criminal justice system doesn't operate in a vacuum, but we are trying to look at the ways in which the practices that we are engaged in contribute to the racial disparities. And so I want to come back to you with a question about this issue of bail and what the North Carolina statute actually says, and then how it's implemented in practice, is one that other folks, in addition to this task force, have been working on for some time. And we may be called on to consider a proposal that would try to implement across the state changes in how magistrates and district court judges, or judges in general, set bonds to eliminate money bonds as much as possible, and so keep people from having to wait in jail before they have been convicted of anything. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
So just District Court Judge Jay Corpening, he's our chief district court judge, and he supervises all the magistrates. And I really wish he was on the call right now, because just as one example, people have heard, and Deborah Dix Maxwell and other great leaders in the NAACP can tell you all about the school to prison pipeline. One thing that we've really tried to do locally is to say, there's a whole category of cases we can keep out of the criminal justice system that arise in our schools, just for example. And so we've implemented a school justice partnership locally where we are not arresting kids for minor things that don't have anything to do with really public safety. When we put so many officers into our schools, and that's a good thing, but we're doing that in response to school shootings like Columbine on forward. many things that were going to the principal's office are now coming to the courts. And so by working with the SROs and by working with the principals, we're making many of those a discipline issue rather than a criminal justice one. And so we're keeping them out to begin with. The ones that are getting into the system, we're also looking at, well, what should really be the bonds in the case of magistrates? What are we have a bond schedule. Jay and I fought to raise the juvenile age. We thought it should be raised to 18 and not be the last state that treated young people as 16-year-olds. And that again has a disproportionate impact on the minority communities. And so again, with the economics of all of this, school should be the safest part of a kid's day. That is the pathway out of poverty. And if we are suspending our kids, if we are having them drop out, we know where that ends up. 2 out of 3 people in our jail right now are high school dropouts. And so the link for us has always been, with the work of the Blue Ribbon Commission and others listening on the line right now, is recognizing that we have to start very early with our kids in particular. And it has to be a community-based approach that involves education to combat incarceration and to combat violence. And so we also believe that that will ultimately give people the pathway to success financially that's at the core of a lot of what has been referred to as not being on the street instead in the black market economy, because that's always been an equal opportunity employer.
Okay, thank you. So I know that Deborah Dix Maxwell is wanting to speak, and I will get to her, but I want to make sure we hear from the 2 folks that also have agreed to talk with us briefly, and that's Michelle Gunn to address us about sentencing. Michelle, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, great, thank you.
Thank you, thank you. My name is Michelle Gunn, and I was born and raised here in Wilmington, North Carolina. So this is definitely my home. I am deeply concerned about this state and how it has treated Black people and people of color who look like me. In my community, in this city, and in this state, I am concerned about the disparities and the inequities that are not a secret, have not been a secret, have historically been ignored, and have been widely known by people who are entrusted to make policies and enforce the rules. But most of all, I am concerned about the disparities and inequities that have been experienced by people who are directly impacted, as well as their families. So I know I read recently that nationally, 1 in every 10 Black males in his 30s somewhere in the United States is either in prison or in jail. So those disparities and inequities are not new. This is something that we have certainly seen. I think that they exist across all systems. And I think that the legal system is no different, and sentencing practices have been no different for those who I know and love. So there are disparities in sentencing in North Carolina with the folks who I know, and Wilmington is not immune from that. Implicit bias shows up, intentional and unintentional harm shows up in my community, in my city, and in my state. It shows up simply because we are all human. Those inequities, I think, don't just begin at sentencing. They begin long before the sentence, regarding some of the things that you talked about previously. For an example, the inequities and disparities begin prior to sentencing at traffic stops, where we know that more Blacks are stopped at a higher rates. It begins prior to sentencing at bail, even though we are doing some of the difficult work. Oftentimes, still, people with money are able to pay their way to freedom when people of low wealth are held and sit in cages. I think that the disparities and inequities also begin at pretrial release, when we use an unknown algorithm to assess the risk of an individual, the risk assessment tool, drawing from existing criminal justice data that we already know is racist. The rates suggest that Black folks are policed more often, arrested more often, jailed more often, give higher bails, receive longer sentences than others. The inequities and disparities, unfortunately, do not end at sentencing. There are also many collateral consequences that I am concerned about that force people out of the race far before they've ever had an equitable chance to enter the race. So I am mostly concerned about certainly having a system that we're able to track the racial disparities and give the community the opportunity to review or access to that information. I'm also concerned about the use of discretion and plea bargaining for most of the folks who I know and who I have been in conversation with. Those are some issues that they would like certainly to be addressed.
Thank you so much. And I think particularly your emphasis on tracking racial disparities as an element of accountability to the community is a really useful insight. I want to go straight to Frankie Roberts, and we'd love to hear from you and your perspective about what we need to be doing.
Wow. I'd like to first thank everyone for the opportunity. Thank you, Attorney General and Justice Earls. So in order to have this conversation and in order for it to be effective, what I like to employ is vulnerability. If we all defend where we sit, we will never get to the resolutions that we're looking for. So we got to be vulnerable. So I would say based on that, someone mentioned earlier about police and the 3 police officers that were fired recently based on their comments. So I have a 25-year-old son that held me accountable and brought my vulnerability into question. And my 25-year-old said he heard me talk about the officers and their comments, and he asked me why was I so surprised. And he said, because Dad, I've been telling you this for the last 7 or 8 years, how we are treated in the hood by officers. And it sounds to me like you didn't really believe me, because now you all of a sudden so surprised. So he said that you only hear from people in middle class culture, Black or white, when they complain. But those of us who live and become victims of that, you don't listen. So I just wanted to just really start with just saying that he called me on the carpet and told me that I needed to do something a long time ago. Certainly I work in the re-entry industry. We work with people returning from prison. We support impacted people, we advocate, and as our Ben David said, that we've been doing expunction clinic. We've been partnering with the DA's office a long time, and the community itself. But however, like Michelle just said, it's no secret that we got disparities, especially in our justice system, and the need for equity is imminent, but we won't get there unless we're vulnerable, unless we really face that, hey, we got some challenges, and I really think we know exactly where to fix those challenges. And our good board chair expressed it. restorative justice. We got to restore the harms that we see and that happens every single day. But again, in order to do that, we got to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, maybe my department or maybe my agency can do things a little better or a little different. And when we talked about officers earlier, yeah, it's more than just one or two. I wish it was just one or two, but we got to be able to face that. But it's gonna always be one or two if I'm your supervisor or I'm your boss, because what you see is based on where you sit. If we don't sit in these communities that talk about how they're treated, then yeah, we just always be in this bubble defending individuals with power and not defending vulnerable people who are poor with no political access. So that's just kind of, I just sit in a seat of listening at the voices of people who need support every day and all day. And I think that I think this group could bring some resolution to it, but we got to do the hard and uncomfortable things. And I would like to hear us when we're talking to be able to just look at that giant right in the face and hit it. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Well, I thank you for bringing some of those voices to us today. So thank you. We have just a few minutes left. Open it up to anyone who wants to speak. As before, make sure your camera's on, wave your hand, and I will call on you. But I promised that I would go for, I know, Mr. McGee, I'll get to you, Saya. But I want to start with Deborah Dix-Maxwell because she's been waiting a long time.
I'm here. Thank you, everyone. Port City proud of the members who have come from this area on here. But to illuminate, we have a lot of work to do. Yes, we do have a mutual understanding and a letter of agreement with the school system. But we also still have elementary school suspensions, which should be something that we need to look at as we go into the school to prison pipeline statewide, because also the presence of an SRO in an elementary school, if it is presented in a negative light, it leads to someone not wanting to become law enforcement, which people tend to forget. And it's definitely a lot of times in a negative light in middle and high school, because you have teachers who do not use classroom management or principals who do not use administrative management because they have law enforcement there. I'm a steering member of the Resiliency Task Force that is addressing the trauma that has been addressed by this city. Not only 1898, it's a pervasive oppression in many areas. The Blue Ribbon Commission sits in a neighborhood that, yes, it is oppressed, but when the school system purposely segregated New Hanover County schools by making inner city charter schools, there was no voice. So now we go through a pandemic with children who are marginalized, segregated, and may not have access. The other thing is that we do have a local campaign to end cash bail that we hope that the task force will readily look at, because that is the criminalization of poverty by the finances in your wallet. If you are unsheltered, you have to pay $300 in this community unless it changed to get out. People have raised those funds. We've done that for Mother's Day. So we need resiliency everywhere for people to understand. We are part of that task force for resiliency because we suffer hurricanes. We suffered many losses, but every community needs to look at doing that, and then they will address some of these systems and some of these issues. We are thankful for the task force. I thank the Justice, I thank Attorney General, I think Secretary Hooks was on earlier, but like Frankie said, we have to be vulnerable. And I would really hope that the data through DPI that shows the suspension rate, that the group that works on that will make it clearer, more accessible, and easily to make each county more accountable for what they're doing as they engage in pipelines. and that we really need to address these issues right. It should have been yesterday, but I'm thankful we're doing it today. Thank you, Justice Earls. Thank you, Attorney General Stein. Thank you, all members of the Coastal Task Force. I'm Port City proud of all of you. Bye.
Well, thank you. And now I do want to go to Mr. McGee. I understand you can bring us the perspective from Bladen, Brunswick, and Columbus counties, which is important for us to hear.
Yes, thank you. My name is Quentin McGee. I'm the Chief Prosecutor in the Bladen County DA's office. And I think one of the many benefits that have come from the renewed interest in social justice and social reform is the scrutiny that's been placed on prosecutors. Ultimately, as an assistant district attorney, we're responsible to the community, and I think any good prosecutor welcomes that. We should all recognize that the criminal justice system is an imperfect system, and we strive to make it better. And I think one of the ways that we do that are having forums like these to listen to community members and people all around the system that have an interest in it. So that's certainly important. Recognizing that as a prosecutor, something has to happen in the criminal justice system. The criminal justice system is reactionary, meaning that something has to happen. A criminal summons is sworn out or a warrant is taken out before we even get a case. But I think it's important as prosecutors to recognize some of the societal and socioeconomic influences that might have brought a person into contact with the community justice system. And so in order to do that, we take steps in the community, and I think it was Deputy Sarvis that mentioned relationships, and that's truly important. I think it's important that the first time you see a prosecutor and come into contact or know one is not when you or your loved one has a matter in court. And to that end, we try to go into our schools, participate in local boards and nonprofits, go to the churches and really engage with the community so that they understand who we are, but most importantly, what we do. And to know that a prosecutor's number one responsibility is not to imprison anybody or to convict people, it's to seek justice. And I think prosecutorial discretion was mentioned by Ms. Gunn earlier, and it's certainly an important tool. And, in the community forums that we have here in Bladen County, where we invite members of the public, members of law enforcement, members from all around the community to engage so that we can have conversations in close groups about the work that we do, and to make folks aware of the tools that we have at our disposal and that we use, particularly diversionary programs such as teen court for our young people so that we do reduce and cut down on the school to prison pipeline. Conditional discharges and deferred prosecutions for first-time offenders are all things that we use because we recognize the impact, the disparate impact of collateral consequences that come from even being charged, not necessarily even being convicted. So, there are a lot of things that we do and a lot of things that are going on, but I think that we move forward and we advance our system to a much greater capacity by having these conversations, and I'm glad to be a part of it, and I thank you for having me.
Well, okay. I know, Ms. Peters, you want to speak? Go ahead. We just have a couple minutes.
Yeah, I won't take long. When you speak about sentencing, you have to speak about equal protection of the law. And we sit here and we talk about there's racial bias and racial injustice within sentencing. We know that. So what's so hard about changing? What's so hard about changing the laws that's affecting the community, that's causing the people of black people of color to continuously be the ones that's being warehoused in these prisons? For example, when you talk about prosecutors and you talk about justice to me is just I see equality being done. If there's no equality in it, it's no justice. Simple as that. If you commit, you have certain prosecutors just to get a conviction, and in our mind, it's all about money. If you don't have the money, you go into prison, you go into jail. Somebody from landfall who commits a crime, whose father has a good relationship with somebody downtown or somebody else, they can get off. They all favor. It's no secret that that's not going on. You can't tell me that that's not what's really happening, because I've been beside somebody in court and watched it happen. Also, if I commit one crime, I end up with 15 different charges. Just so you can get me to plead guilty to an offense, besides me saying, okay, I might want to take it to trial. I might want to go to trial, But because this one offense has brought 5, 6, 7 other offense charges along with it, then you're gonna force me to say, yo, you know what? I'm gonna take a plea agreement, and then when I get in prison, I start to study the law a little better and realize, oh man, I could have probably beat that, but you didn't put me on the line now. Bail, when you speak of bail, when you put somebody in jail, knowing that you set a bond high enough that you know this person don't have the money. You know this person don't have the money to get out. You let them sit in jail for X amount of months. That person gonna say, I'm tired of sitting in jail. I'm ready to take the first thing coming to me. Prosecutors do that. Every day, prosecutors do that. The public defenders, they don't want to do it because their caseload too high, too heavy. So they're gonna just try to push you on through so they can get to the next person and push them on through. Now you got a system where you got people sitting in prison and it's constantly rotating them in and out, in and out, in and out. Now you got somebody that's saying, man, I ain't taking no plea agreement. He don't take the plea agreement, he go to trial. He get 60 years for a charge that he could have. It don't make sense. Help me to understand why in order for you to change sentencing, you got to start dealing with the laws that was created to get this sentence. You can't talk about sentencing justice, sentencing reform if you're not dealing with the offenses that carry the sentence. You have to dismantle the whole system. It's not broken, it's designed. It's the whole system is designed. And we sit here talking about racial equality. So if you know that you know that you have racial inequalities within the system, then you got to dismantle the whole system. You have to dismantle the whole system and start all over again. You have to be re-educated to everything that's going on today because we're dealing with different times. The same way you got to get the right police officers in there, you got to get the right prosecutors in there. You got to get the right DAs in there that look just like us. And don't just look like us, but see the way we see things as well. We all know and understand you got to uphold the law. You got to be lenient sometimes, and you got to be hard when it comes to violent offenses. But when you got somebody with a petty drug offense, a simple possession charge, and you give him a term of imprisonment that exceeds the crime, that's not right. And that's what's continually going on today. And that's why the prison system is the way it is right now today. Deal with the root of the situation before you can go talk about having conversations about anything. And that's the way the law is designed and drawn up. And get the people out of there who's continuously with that mindset that be tough on crime.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we have to cut the discussion off, but I will. I want to make sure that you all know that you have been heard. And with that, I will turn it over to Attorney General Stein to wrap us up.
Thank you, Justice Earls. Thank all of you for your very compelling words today. And to the extent we weren't able to hear from each of you or hear from each of you fully, we have an online system. And this is true for anybody who's watching this on YouTube. Just go to my website, ncdoj.gov/TREC, TREC, and there's a form that you can fill out and share your ideas about what we need to review and consider changing in our criminal justice system so that it is fairer for everybody. We have so much food for thought from what you all raised today, and I'm so appreciative of everybody taking their time and all of your very sincere and genuine commitment to trying to make things better, because that's what this whole effort is about. So thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you.